Welcome to Deloitte M&A Views, a Deloitte podcast series exploring the latest trends and topics in mergers and acquisitions. I'm Greg Jarrett. Today we're discussing M&A activity in the automotive industry, specifically around the automotive ecosystem. The industry's seen a blurring of traditional industry lines, and we'll explore how new entrants are transforming the industry and how companies can position themselves for success in this new environment. We're joined by Mark Holzer, a partner with Deloitte & Touche LLP, and Deloitte's M&A practice, and Neil Ganguly, a principal with Deloitte Consulting LLP and leader of the automotive supplier practice. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time with us today. Mark and Neil, the topic of M&A in the automotive industry and the transformation we're seeing around the future of mobility seems to be causing a major shift, and that's putting it lightly. Let's take a high-level look at the automotive industry and how M&A is playing a role. Mark, how about you give us your thoughts first?
I think you nailed the circumstances of today quite well. There's really historically high level of M&A and partnership activity and collaboration activity in the automotive marketplace right now. We're seeing disruption everywhere. Traditional roles, the 100-year relationship between the vehicle manufacturers and the supplier is being disrupted internally from the suppliers themselves, from new entrants, primarily from the technology industry, the OEMs themselves as they try to develop new business models based on the notion of mobility and services as opposed to just selling vehicles. From a traditional automotive supplier perspective, we're also seeing continued consolidation around certain vehicle segments, like in automotive interiors, and a continued effort and focus within the supplier community to build scale on a global basis to meet their customer, the automotive OEM's needs. I think the other really interesting thing that we're seeing lately is the effect of electrification and electric vehicles. A number of large suppliers have announced plans to split themselves apart, in effect, putting part of their business that's focused on supplying internal combustion engines and transmissions in one silo and the piece that's agnostic to that in another. Also, you've seen a number of governments, China most recently, the UK and France, announce plans to potentially phase out the internal combustion engine. I think these type of macro trends will really have a profound impact on strategic choices for a number of suppliers. And obviously, the elephant in the room is the impact of new entrants, particularly from the technology industry, trying to stake out a piece of the automotive value chain. We've seen multi-billion-dollar acquisitions in the past year as traditional technology players have tried to enter the automotive supply chain. So in short, I think the game, the rules, the players, and the scoring is all changing very rapidly in the automotive ecosystem.
Interesting and complex, Mark. Let's get back to the players on this. Back to the end of the horse and buggy and the evolution of the auto industry into just the few key players we all recognized in the 20th century. Now we're way past that. It's been upended, extending well beyond those traditionally in the space. Neil, what does all this mean?
So right now, the industry lines are blurring, and a lot of new players from technology, from chemical space, and so on, are getting into the automotive value chain that we know and wanting to own pieces of the value chain that probably will create new opportunities for themselves, as well as for other players in the industry, including traditional suppliers. We've already seen new suppliers emerge that challenge traditional conventions in areas like electronics and software and service spaces. To give you a few examples, connected services, cybersecurity, data analytics, and so on. New players are starting to form partnerships, not only with other players from outside the industry, but also with traditional suppliers, as well as with OEMs themselves, to reshape the value chain and the content platform ownership, given the proliferation of software that is going on and is going to continue, in fact, I would say exponentially increase. The new entrants sometimes bring different capital structures, operate at different paces. You're aware about how electronics moves in days and weeks versus the automotive value chain or the automotive product development cycle that moves in years. On top of that, these new players often hold huge cash reserves, which they have been willing to spend to acquire companies, to acquire talent, and these kinds of strengths may help them flourish in the segments where they want to own. I think in addition, they bring a different mindset to the product development cycle. In many respects, we're looking at the electronic and software agile product development cycle come and meld in with the traditional linear 3 to 5 year automotive value chain and product development cycle. And we believe there's going to be a melding of the two. We're going to have to see how these players evolve and attack these complex issues.
Mark, listening so far, I'm thinking back to my first car, and the biggest thing I was concerned about was if the water pump was going to go out in the middle of the road. Now I'm worried about all sorts of other complex things. So could you help me? Could you be more specific about where all these players are coming from and what they're bringing to the table?
I think there's an overall set of strategic considerations and strategic implications, particularly for the incumbents, to think about with all these moves. First, just thinking about it from the perspective of a traditional supplier. As I mentioned earlier, global scale and size is becoming more critical than it ever was. The ability to leverage R&D, SG&A costs, product development costs over a large revenue base will be key to a supplier's success. If you go back to the time when you were worried about your water pump 15 or 20 years ago, the play was a supplier conglomerate, individual suppliers supplying components all over the vehicle. Now the play is focus, size, and scale. And with that drives an ability on the part of the suppliers who figured that out to deliver high-quality components around the world in a very cost-competitive manner. That's going to be tough to deal with if you're not making those moves from a strategic perspective. Now, shifting outside of the traditional supply base, I think the entrance of these new competitors, particularly from the technology industry, bring an even broader set of disruptive capabilities. I think first, their R&D and engineering capabilities are substantial and significant. Designing software and electronics is what they do, and it's what they do well. Second, as we all know, the financial capability these firms bring, unencumbered by a legacy industrial base, is significant. And certainly, the average technology company has more financial capital and wherewithal than the typical automotive supplier. Competing in a financial race with these players will be difficult. Third, I think they bring a knowledge of consumer preferences and a connection with the consumer that the typical automotive supplier may not have. They also have an ability to rapidly shift business models to meet demand. Again, not something that's been required historically in the automotive value chain. And I think probably more important, they're eager to play. As I talked about earlier, we've seen billions of dollars in capital deployed by these companies to enter automotive. They're aggressive. They see value in playing in automotive. And I think given all these dynamics, they'll be formidable competitors. I think the other area to think about just in terms of the ecosystem is around startups. We talked a little bit about things that aren't in the vehicle now but will be in 5 years, or things that are here now that weren't 5 years ago, whether it's around battery technology, connected vehicles, new methods of selling services into the car. The impact of startups and their ability to disrupt and take share is something that shouldn't be underestimated. So in short, the playing field is crowded. There's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of challenges. And from the standpoint of being a traditional player in the ecosystem, a traditional automotive supplier, or even an OEM, there's a lot of looking over your shoulder to see who's coming after you. It's a tough place to be in a very competitive field.
Oh, we've got a lot of information coming in here. We've heard a lot of opportunity for growth, but along with that, a lot of disruption to the industry continuing to impact how companies can stay competitive. So, Neil, is there one thing or one group of things that automotive suppliers should be focusing on?
We recently released our third global automotive supplier study, where we look at exactly that question: is what will drive future performance? Now, if you look at the past, we've done this study over the last decade. In looking at the last decade, the top performers tended to follow strategies that are cost-focused, improve profitability and cash flow, product portfolio leadership, market-focused R&D investments, and so on. Looking into the future, we've identified some how-to-win strategic choices to consider for suppliers. Now, while this cost focus is going to be key to be able to create the capital to invest at higher growth segments in innovative businesses for the future, suppliers can execute a variety of strategies, many of which include M&A as well, to win in future, such as suppliers in the traditional segments could go and look at scaling up and consolidation. We've seen a number of that. There are traditional players that go and partner and acquire new technologies to be able to shape or move into new business model ecosystems that are emerging. And overall, there's a move from a very asset-heavy company, and people are going to need to think about how much capital it takes to run this. This is a very asset-intensive business historically, but we see that changing. In fact, referring back to that third global study, we see that 70% of the value created in shareholder value over the last decade are by companies that are relatively more asset light. So dealing with this capital intensity, either by scaling up or consolidating or acquiring or partnering with new talent and new companies that bring the services and new business models, is going to be key for the suppliers to think about.
Mark, with the blurring of industries, competitive market, and the high M&A activity, can you summarize what we should be prepared to see out of all this?
I think the next 5 years, and certainly the next decade, are going to be incredibly exciting in the automotive ecosystem. So if you come back to today, and if you're a supplier or an OEM, you really have two challenges. One, you need to adapt to the future. You need to figure out what it is, and you need to develop the capabilities and skill sets needed to win in this undefined environment. But you also have to deal with reality of your business today. We all know automotive is cyclical. Volumes have been on the rise for the last decade, but they're slowing. So a lot of the traditional issues, capacity, fixed cost, the need to maintain vehicle volumes, both for the OEM and the supplier, capital requirements, regulatory, pricing, those are all still here, and they all still need to be dealt with. But at the same time, these companies need to deal with the entrance of large technology companies, startups, and developing strategies for new business models. So I think with all this happening at the same time, it's really a fascinating time to be in and around the automotive and mobility ecosystem, and we can all sit back and see what happens over the coming years.
Thanks, Neil, and thank you, Mark. We've learned an awful lot today. Deloitte's put together a brief presentation on some of the many services offered in the automotive sector.
We're human beings. We were born to move, and how we get around is always changing. Take the cars we drive. In just over a century, we've gone from horseless carriage to souped-up techno marvels on wheels. Bluetooth connection, collision protection, electromagnetic propulsion, the stuff of science fiction is now standard. We've even got cars that drive themselves. At this point, it's clear the future of mobility will feature all kinds of twists and turns. Count on Deloitte to keep you up to speed and moving forward. Whether you're an automaker, regulator, or in a business connected to the auto industry, Deloitte's accessible data and powerful insights can help you navigate the ever-shifting automotive landscape, so you can stay on top of new technology, new competitors, and most important of all, new opportunities.
You have arrived at your destination.
Look again. Big changes are coming. Have you seen them? Look to Deloitte. For data analysis, insight, and more, visit Deloitte.com/automotive.
I'm Greg Jarrett, and thanks for listening to Deloitte M&A Views, sponsored by Deloitte's M&A Institute. We release new podcasts regularly, and if you subscribe, you won't miss a single one. To stay connected and receive more information on Deloitte M&A service offerings, visit www.deloitte.com/US/MA subscribe and follow us on Twitter at Deloitte M&A. Until next time.